Good morning. My name is Ben Roberts. I'm a Senior Research Manager at the Human Sciences Research Council and Coordinator of the annual South African Social Attitudes Survey. Today we'll be talking about some of the high-level results from an analysis that was done with support from the ESRC Pathfinder grant, examining different facets of attitudes to inequality in South Africa, with a particular emphasis on the 2009 results, but also locating these within trends that have been captured throughout the last decade, covering 2003 to 2012. In terms of the structure of the presentation, I'll begin by providing a contextual background to the study, in particular the research questions that have informed it. I'll then give a methodological overview of the study that focuses on describing the data that was used for analytical purposes. This leads us into several results section. The first of these addresses general beliefs about inequality in South African society and touches on indicators such as inequality aversion, perceived class tensions, as well as views regarding labour market earnings. This leads into general preferences for state-led redistribution in principle, and how this has begun to change or not over the last decade or so, as well as examining the degree to which there's a consensus across a range of subgroups in the country around this principle. Finally, the results turn to support for specific redress policies in practice. And again, we'll examine differences across different subgroups, particularly with a particular emphasis on race, class and cohort variation. Finally, we'll conclude with some reflections for policy, as well as proposed next steps in terms of an analytical agenda moving forward. So why do inequality attitudes matter? Firstly, inequality clearly remains an indelible feature of the socio-economic structure of South Africa. A number of studies have attested to this fact, including the National Income Dynamics Survey conducted by the University of Cape Town, as well as measures of small area deprivation undertaken by the South African Social Policy Research Institute. In South Africa as well as globally, there is growing interest in inequality, particularly due to the evidence that a high level of inequality may cause a range of socioeconomic problems, from issues of social cohesion and interpersonal trust through to crime and violence. Also, government's transformative social policy program to address colonial as well as apartheid legacies of deprivation and marginalization has given increasing prominence to inequality reduction alongside poverty alleviation and economic growth. This is clearly attested to by its inclusion as a core objective of the current National Development Plan, which spells out a vision of where we want our society to be by 2030, and it's specified a reduction in the Gini coefficient from 0.69 down to 0.6 over that interval. Also, all this is set against a context of continuing waves of service delivery and related protests, coupled with recent developments in the mining and agricultural sectors, where there's been quite vigorous earnings-related protest action, trying to bring about a transformative agenda there. And this has begun to raise fundamental questions about the nature of mass and elite opinion regarding inequality in our society two decades after the transition to democracy. We would contend, therefore, that there is a need for a nuanced understanding of the general beliefs, preferences and policy attitudes in relation to inequality and redress, and how these have been changing over time. Firstly, and somewhat surprisingly for a high-income society such as South Africa, we know relatively little about public attitudes to inequality and redistribution. The body of quantitative work that does exist on such attitudes remains fairly circumscribed, and there are very few studies that are nationally representative in nature. Furthermore, there are concerns that have been expressed by policymakers as well as other stakeholders regarding the possible association between such attitudes and political behavioural action. This includes issues such as electoral participation and choice, engagement in social movements, as well as protest action. There is also the possibility that the perceived fairness of policies may ultimately facilitate or impede their effective implementation. And lastly, examining and understanding recent trends in inequality attitudes may further serve as a basis for predicting and monitoring changes in the medium to long term. In response to this perceived need, this particular component of the ESRC Pathfinder study examined three principal questions. What are public attitudes to economic inequality? What is the public preference for state-led redistribution? And lastly, what are public attitudes to policy responses to economic inequality? A number of additional sub-questions were also examined. This includes what variations in attitudes are there by key dimensions, for instance, social class, gender, race and age? How have public attitudes to inequality changed over time? And how do attitudes in South Africa compare relative to other countries? In terms of methodology, use was made of the South African Social Attitude Survey, or SASAS. This is a nationally representative survey series that has been conducted on an annual basis since 2003 by the Human Sciences Research Council of South Africa. The SASAS series was designed with the British Social Attitude Survey as well as the American General Social Survey series clearly in mind, and the late Professor Roger Jowl, the former director of the British Social Attitude Survey and the European Social Survey, served as a special advisor in conceptualizing and setting up the series. SASAS aims to gather information on the attitudes, beliefs, behaviour patterns and values of a representative sample of South African individuals aged 16 years and older living in private residence. The intention of this series is to measure specific attitudes and opinions on a diverse set of topics that are deemed of national relevance. The survey is administered by means of face-to-face interviewing in the last quarter of each calendar year. For the ESRC Inequality project, we made use of SASAS rounds which were conducted between 2003 and 2012, with a particular focus on round 7 which was administered in 2009. SASAS is also part of what is called the International Social Survey Programme, or ISSP. This is a consortium of approximately 48 member countries that on an annual basis agree to field a module on a predefined topic. The 2009 module administered by the ISSP focused on social inequalities, which fits very neatly with this particular theme of the ESRC Pathfinder project, and as such opens up new possibilities for comparative analysis of the attitudes that we find in South Africa relative to a host of other nations. So we now come to our first set of substantive empirical results, which focus on the general beliefs that South Africans hold in respect of inequality in the country. It could be argued that in tackling pervasive income and other social inequalities in South African society, one of the fundamental prerequisites would be for a broad-based recognition or awareness that income inequality is detrimental to developmental progress. Several measures are present in SASAS and the ISSP that enable us to begin to explore the extent of inequality aversion in the country, as well as income distribution preferences. And over the next few slides we'll begin to explore a few of these in a little more detail. The first of these items is a common question included to provide an indicative sense of awareness of income inequality. It involves asking respondents to state, using a standard 5-point agreement scale, the extent to which they support or reject the notion that differences in income in South Africa are too large. In effect, this measure combines individual awareness of the scale of inequality on the one hand, together with explicit judgments about the fairness of this perceived level of inequality. As we can see from the line graph presented on the screen, in late 2011, a considerable majority of South Africans, or 85%, agreed that differences in income in South Africa are too large, with approximately 2/5 or 40% expressing strong support with the statement. The figure also shows the pattern of responses over the last decade, revealing a modest decline in aversion between 2003 and 2005, after which there was a steady increase as the effect of economic hard times began to set in with the mid to late 2000s. However, on the whole, the picture is one of relative stability, with levels of inequality aversion fluctuating within a fairly narrow range. Since this inequality aversion measure has been included in the 2009 ISSP Social Inequality module, we are able to examine the extent to which South Africans approximate or differ from citizens of other countries in their professed level of aversion. From the figure on the screen, it is apparent that South Africa is ranked 10th out of 40 countries in terms of the total percentage expressing an aversion to inequality. This ranges from a low in the Philippines and Norway, where 51 and 61% respectively voice aversion, to a high in Hungary and the Ukraine, where there's near universal aversion. We also overlay levels of inequality in the country using the Gini coefficient, and what we see is effectively the absence of a linear relationship between inequality aversion as well as actual levels of inequality. In the case of South Africa, for instance, we see very high levels of inequality corresponding with a high level of aversion. In other countries, this relationship clearly isn't present. In this slide, we take the same cross-national distribution on the inequality aversion measure, but instead of overlaying absolute levels of inequality, we actually look to absolute levels of poverty, using gross national income per capita as our key variable. In this instance, we see that there is a stronger association between the two variables, so that the poorer the country, the greater the likelihood that they will express the view that differences in their country are too large. And in better off countries, the converse tends to apply. Another ISSP measure that aims to capture public views towards economic inequality draws on an approach based on pictorial and verbal representations of societal stratification that was initially experimented with in the late 1970s and extended across national research from the 1990s onwards. Respondents are effectively presented with 5 diagrams that portray possible class distributions, each with labels that depict those possible societies. And those are shown in the graphic on the screen. So it ranges from the first type A, which is a society with a small group of rich people at the top and very few people in the middle and a great majority of people at the bottom, right down to the 5th type, where we have many more people near the top and only a few people near the bottom of the distribution. The respondents were then asked to decide which image they believed most closely depicted South African society today, as well as their preferences for what the country should ideally look like. From the table on the screen, it is again apparent that South Africans perceive the country as highly unequal, with half the population viewing the society as consisting of a small class of elites with a significant mass at the bottom of the distribution, in other words type A, with a further 29% stating that country has a more pyramidal shape with a small elite on top, larger intermediate classes and a sizable class at the base of the structure. That's type B. If we jump to the other end of the distribution, type E, we can see that very nominal shares see South Africa as a case where there are many people near the top and only a few near the bottom. Turning to preferences regarding stratification in the country, there was a robust support for a more equalitarian structure, with slightly more than 3/4, or 77%, preferring South African society to be characterized by a situation where most are either in the middle or upper classes, in other words type D or E. Using a scoring system that's been proposed internationally, we find that this preference signifies a shift from an average of a score of 31 to an ideal of 88. Therefore, as with the case of the previous inequality aversion indicator, South Africans clearly are cognizant of the extreme class-based inequalities that exist in the country, and furthermore there is a stark disparity between this view of present reality and the type of society citizens ideally envision. We are again able to locate South African attitudes in comparative perspective by drawing on the 2009 ISSP data. What is readily apparent from the graph on the screen is the fact that for all countries in the sample, the preference for a more equalitarian society is universally present, even in Nordic countries who are at the top end of the distribution on the current image of society scale. However, the gap is appreciably larger amongst poorer countries in the sample. So if we look at the far right-hand side, the case of Norway, we see that the current mean score is 84 in terms of current societal evaluations, and the ideal jumps up to 92, a difference of 8 points. If we jump right across to the left-hand side, the case of Ukraine, current society is rated as on average as 18, with a preference of increasing that to 91, a difference of 73 points. So clearly we're seeing quite sizable gulf in terms of differences across the full distribution in terms of current assessments of the stratification of and nature of society. But the key message that we take away is clearly that citizens around the globe have a consensual vision of a more equitable society, and furthermore that societies in poorer nations have an especially large appetite for change, and in this regard South Africa is no exception. One measure that is used as an indication of the quality of society concerns views on the presence and extent of distributional conflict, since this may exert an influence on individual welfare. The 2009 ISSP module asks respondents the following. In all countries, there are differences or even conflicts between different social groups. In your opinion, in South Africa, how much conflict is there between, firstly, poor and rich people, secondly, working class and the middle class, thirdly, workers in management, and lastly, between people at the top and bottom of society? Answers were captured on a 4-point scale ranging from very strong conflicts to no conflicts at all. The aggregate pattern of results is very similar for 3 of the 4 measures in terms of poor and rich people, the working class and middle class, and people at the top and bottom of society, with 55% of citizens perceiving strong or very strong class tensions, and close to a quarter reporting only slight tensions, and under a fifth reporting no tensions at all. In the class of workers in management, this perceived level of tension is even more acute, with 2/3 or 67% indicating that there are tensions between workers and management. And this fits in quite clearly with the current debates which are happening certainly in certain sectors of the economy, particularly the mining sector, where there's been very vigorous contestation around the nature of executive pay. Perceived conflict is also again a relatively common feature across social classes in the country, and we find that considerable shares tend to report conflict irrespective of whether one belongs to the poorest or wealthiest quintile. Given the high level of inequality evident in South Africa, one of the key questions we have to ask is to what extent the perceived level of class tension is typical or higher relative to other countries. So in this particular slide we give 2 key examples using again the 2009 ISSP data. The first example we look at is the perceived tension between the rich and the poor. What we've done is reversed the scale so that 1 represents no conflicts and 4 very strong conflicts, and then we've ranked the mean score on this scale for each of the 40 countries. What we find is South Africa is slightly above the all-country average of 2.49, but is ranked 11th out of the 40 countries. The top-rated countries in terms of the high levels of tension between rich and poor are present in Hungary and South Korea, Russia, Turkey, Italy and Venezuela. So South Africa fares higher than average, but behind some of a number of other countries. If we look at the perceived tension between management and workers, we are again above average, which is 2.54 for all the countries. But South Africa's ranking is considerably higher. It's ranked 5th out of the 40 countries, behind South Korea, Hungary, France and Portugal. So again, this fits into the narrative of broad-based class tension present in South Africa and higher than average, but in certain contexts the tensions in the workplace are appreciably larger. And I think this speaks also to the nature of inequality generally in South Africa, which is derived fundamentally from inequality differentials in the labour market. Research by the University of Cape Town has shown that wage income accounts for approximately 85% of income inequality in the country, signifying that the labour market has a predominant role in driving persisting income disparities, with educational disparities also a key underlying factor. This economic situation has assumed increasing importance in recent years as we've seen increasing strike action in relation to demands for fair remuneration in certain key sectors such as the mines and on farms. Such events have provoked vigorous economic policy debate about wage inequality, standard of living and quality of life in the country. It has also led to symbolic gestures of solidarity, such as that by President Zuma himself in late 2012, who requested that CEOs and executive directors in both the public and private sectors institute a freeze in salaries and bonuses during the 2013 year in order to showcase a commitment to building an equitable economy. While discussion about such proposals have been occurring in policymaking and academic circles, limited empirical evidence exists on the public view regarding pay differentials. It's therefore instructive to examine the measures that were included in the 2009 ISSP module on legitimate pay earnings. Respondents were initially asked to estimate the gross monthly income of 5 different occupations, ranging from an unskilled worker to a cabinet minister, after which they were requested to specify what they thought people in these occupations ought to be earning. Based on the descriptive stats presented in the table on the screen, several observations can be drawn. Firstly, South Africans perceive sizable differences in earnings between occupations, with doctors seen as earning 14 times more than an unskilled worker, a company chairperson 18 times higher, and a cabinet minister 38 times more. Secondly, there's a strong preference for the wages of unskilled or low-skilled workers to increase significantly, with an associated desire for the wages of higher occupational categories to be lower than current perceived levels. At the time of interviewing in late 2009, South Africans on average reported a 45% rise in the gross monthly earnings of an unskilled worker, and a 40% increase in the wages of a shop assistant. At the other end of the occupational spectrum, there's a particularly strong demand for the salaries of cabinet ministers to be reduced, followed to a lesser degree by a reduction in wages of general practitioners, with only a modest preferred reduction in the wages of company chairpersons. Thirdly, the ranking of occupations based on ethical wages remains unchanged relative to perceived actual earnings, with South Africans on the whole appearing rather tolerant of large earning differentials, despite the recognition of the need for a narrowing of the gap between the lower and the higher occupational classes. These findings are all broadly consistent with other analyses of subjective wage inequality that have been conducted using ISSP data. Taken together, the analysis conducted so far offers a fairly consistent and convincing picture of the concern expressed by the South African public over the extent of income and wage inequality in the country, as well as the general preference that tends to exist for a reduction in such differences. The SASAS data shows that a sizable majority of the adult population believe that income differences are too large. In addition, the results suggest that the public feels that such inequalities may have compromised efforts at promoting a socially cohesive society, with a significant share stating that there exist strong class tensions in the country. Since the labour market in South Africa represents the main source of income inequality in the country, it is also important to observe that the public is keenly aware of and favours a narrowing in wage inequality between different occupations, through both an increase of incomes amongst the low paid, as well as a reduction at the top end. The fact that these findings are evident across the class spectrum is important for South African democracy, as it suggests that in principle there exists a relatively broad consensus about income and wage inequalities, both in terms of awareness and preferences for change. What remains to be seen, however, is whether there exists an equally resolute belief concerning state-led redress, and what factors tend to shape such support for redistribution in the country. This is what we'll now turn to. Redistribution represents one of the core traditional roles assumed by the state, and given both the persistently high level of income inequality in South Africa, as well as the public's general aversion for inequality, it is important to better understand and reflect on public perceptions of the government in redistributing income between wealthier and more deprived citizens. The 2009 ISSP module included several items that relate to redistribution preferences. The most commonly used indicator in this tradition asks respondents whether they support or oppose the view that it is the responsibility of the government to reduce the differences in income between people with high incomes and those with low incomes. And this is employed as the main variable of focus for this component of the ESRC project. Responses were captured using a standard 5-point agreement scale, ranging from strongly agree to strongly disagree. Apart from being included in the 2009 ISSP module, this measure has been included in every round of SESA since 2006. This allows us again to see how stable preferences have remained over the better part of the last decade. The statistics presented in the graph on the screen provide fairly convincing evidence that on average South Africans exhibit a strong preference for redistribution and tend to vest support in the government to reduce material differences between the rich and poor. In 2012, an estimated 2/3 reported a preference for government-led income redistribution, with less than a fifth opposing it. Over the full 2006 to 2012 interval, on average, 69% favoured state-led redress, compared with only 16% expressing unfavourable views. There are nonetheless some signs that there's been a shift in preferences over the period. In 2006, there was an overwhelming demand for redistribution, common to nearly 8 in 10 South Africans. But by 2012, this had dropped by approximately 12 percentage points. Furthermore, if we look at the strong agreement category, we find that the share of the adult population that professes a strong preference for redistribution has also fallen from 35 down to 26% between 2006 and 2012. This finding that support for redistribution has shown a slightly declining trend, while aversion to inequality has remained at a fairly consistent high level, is particularly noteworthy, and it is likely to be the subject of fairly robust debate and analysis in the years to come, most especially in relation to what might be the possible drivers or determinants of this change. We again felt that it would be instructive to locate South African preferences for redistribution within a broader comparative perspective, and we again turn to the 2009 ISSP for assistance in that regard. We've ranked the mean support for government-led redress in each of the 14 nations from lowest to highest. We can see that the lowest score in 2009 was in the US at 2.67 out of a maximum of 5, ranging up to the highest demand in the Ukraine with a reported 4.45. The all-country average in 2009 was 3.85, and that's the green bar in the middle of the distribution. Firstly, in terms of South Africa's position relative to these other countries, we can see it's slightly left of the all-country average at 3.78. So it is perhaps slightly lower than we would have anticipated given the high levels of inequality evident in the country. But it clearly fares a lot lower than a lot of Central and Eastern European states, such as Ukraine, Hungary, Russia, Slovenia, and so on. The other two red bars give a sense of how South African values in relation to government-led redress has actually changed over the 2006 to 2012 period. So we can see on the right-hand side that we have South African average for 2006 at 4.0. So it is slightly above the 2009 average for that year. So, and we can see that it's significantly higher than the 3.78 average that is observed 3 years later. Again, if we jump from 2009 to 2012, we see that there's been a further fall from 3.78 down to 3.7. And again, that just shows that slowly there has been an erosion in broad support for government-led redress in the country. Obviously, the picture does not show dynamics within other nations. Unfortunately, we don't have data for that. So it is making a significant assumption that other countries are remaining fairly static, particularly in the context of the effects of the global economic crisis. But nonetheless, it does show, certainly for South Africa in isolation, that there has been a discernible drop in in its position on this key indicator. And obviously that is going to, as we've said going forward, raise fundamental questions about what may be driving this change in perspective. Unlike inequality aversion, South Africans tend to display less uniformity in their preferences relating to the role of government in redistributing income. Specifically, we find that based on the pooled 2006 to 2012 results, that support for government redress is found to vary substantially on the basis of race, gender, educational attainment, employment status, self-rated poverty status, as well as geographic location. In the figure on the screen, the percentage that support state-led redress over the 2006 to 2012 period is presented for different social groups, together with a national average represented in the dashed red line. Strong racial differences emerge, with black and coloured South Africans reporting the highest support and white South Africans the greatest opposition to government redistribution. In terms of class, the poor are more likely than the non-poor to voice support, with similar entrenched positions evident amongst those with primary or no schooling, the unemployed, and those in informal urban settlements and rural traditional authority areas. Despite these attitudinal disparities, it is nonetheless important to note that on average, more than half of white, tertiary educated and non-poor South Africans are supportive of government redistribution in principle. In spite of broad acceptance of the principle of redress, emerging research has tended to show that this is often accompanied by more polarized attitudes towards policies that have been designed to address social injustice and bring about economic and racial transformation in South Africa. This is often referred to as the principal implementation gap. To gain a sense of the extent of this principal implementation gap, patterns of support and opposition to a set of policies were examined, covering domains such as land, employment, education, social security, culture and progressive taxation. Some of these measures have been regularly fielded in SASAS, while others have tended to be included in only certain rounds of interviewing. All measures employed a standard 5-point agreement scale. The table on the screen presents public attitudes towards a select number of these redress policies using the 2009 SASAS data. Several points are worth drawing your attention to based on the pattern of results. Firstly, on aggregate, there does appear to be broad support for the measures, ranging from a low of 53% in the case of sports quotas to a high of 82% for basic provisioning for the unemployed. Only sports quotas were supported by less than 60% of the adult population on average. Secondly, where trend data is available, the results do suggest a considerable degree of stability in attitudes towards redress policies over the 2003 to 2012 period. Thirdly, to an extent, attitudes seem moderately more favourable towards interventions focused on class-based redress, where the emphasis rests more on addressing material as opposed to racial disadvantage. So as such, we find a somewhat high general support for measures that were designed to address employment deprivation and educational inequality in schools and tertiary institutions, compared to race preferential policy interventions such as sports quotas, land redistribution and affirmative action. Over the next few slides, we'll look at race and class differences that underlie attitudes towards policies for reducing inequality in South Africa, based on pooled data for the various survey rounds conducted between 2003 and 2012. On this slide in particular, what emerges is a stark racial gradient in policy attitudes, which is most evident in relation to affirmative action, land reform, and restitution for the victims of apartheid. In these instances, black South Africans were appreciably more supportive than other population groups generally, and white citizens in particular. On average over the interval, support for affirmative action and land reform was nearly 5 times higher among black respondents relative to white respondents. In addition, we find that less than a third of coloured and Indian South Africans expressed positive views on these policies. And we can see that a similar pattern is found in relation to compensation of apartheid victims and, to a slightly lesser degree, sports quotas. We also find that there's less variability between race groups in relation to redress measures such as unemployment-related social policy, school integration, university opportunities for poor youth, increased spending on social grants, as well as progressive taxation. At least 3/5 of white adults are partial to school integration and expanding university opportunities for poor youth. Around half of white adults support increased grant spending and progressive taxation. So it really showcases the fact that there are distinct patterns relative to class-based versus race-based redress interventions. Using self-reported poverty status as an indicator of class, it is apparent that class differences in redress policy attitudes are somewhat less pronounced than the previously discussed racial patterns of variation. However, we find significant social cleavages still exist, again with greater variation present in respect of race preferential policies than those framed more in terms of addressing material disadvantage. Those that classify themselves as non-poor consistently registered lower levels of policy support compared to those identifying themselves as just getting by or poor. Support among poor South Africans is between 1.4 and 1.5 times higher than the non-poor for land reform, affirmative action and apartheid compensation. More convergent views emerge for policy support for the unemployed, school integration, tertiary education opportunities for poor students, and the provision of social grants, with between 2/3 and 3/5 of the non-poor voicing approval of such measures. To provide greater insight into patterns of support and opposition, class and cohort differences within race groups were examined and will be presented in the next two slides. This is intended to better understand whether differential levels of social solidarity exist among South Africa's elite, but also generate some preliminary evidence on the attitudinal similarity or divergence of the post-apartheid generation to older cohorts. The focus is on a subset of the policy measures which have been more regularly included in SESAS to allow for sufficient sample sizes for the subgroup analysis, with the analysis again based on pooled data. In this slide, which looks at class-based differences within race groups, we find that there's only a small class gradient in attitudes amongst black South Africans, with around 3/5 of black elites supporting 5 of the 6 measures that we examine. The biggest class difference that's apparent is in relation to unemployment-related social policy, where there's a 12 percentage point difference. Though even in this instance, a sizable majority of elites clearly support the redress measure. Among coloured adults, there's a negligible class effect for land reform, affirmative action or sports quotas, and there are relatively small differences on the other 3 measures. There's a more distinct class gradient amongst Indian adults in relation to land reform and affirmative action, with barely more than a quarter of Indian elites viewing such policies positively. Broad-based support again exists for unemployment-related social policy and school integration. Lastly, there is little sign of class-based differences in redress policy support amongst white South Africans. Irrespective of class position, lower support is registered amongst white adults in terms of all the policies that we've tested, except for those aiming at addressing the living standards of the unemployed and school integration. With regard to cohort differences within race groups, we find that in many instances young South Africans who are born or grew up in post-apartheid South Africa generally do not exhibit positions on redress policies that are vastly different from older generations. Therefore, when discussing policies such as land reform, affirmative action, or sports quotas, young white South Africans appear almost equally as opposed as older cohorts, while young black South Africans report broadly similar levels of support as older cohorts. Although coloured teenagers appear slightly more supportive of affirmative action and sports quotas than older generations, they still tend to hold a fairly unfavourable perspective on these interventions. On class-based redress measures, there are no considerable cohort differences for unemployment-related social policy for any of the race groups. The same applies to black South Africans in terms of their attitudes on school integration and social grants. However, an interesting finding is that young coloured, Indian and white South Africans all seem more sanguine about social grants compared to older generations, and this may actually be a positive indication for continued support in future for social security policies in the country. In this presentation, we have aimed to convey some of the high-level findings associated with the component of the ESRC Pathfinder grant that aim to explore the views of the South African public towards economic inequality, general preferences for government redistribution, as well as levels of support for social policies intended to bring about racial and economic transformation in the country. Over the next couple of slides, we'll look at some of the main findings from the analytical work that we've conducted, as well as outline some of the next steps involved in the ESRC Pathfinder grant process. The results of our study suggest that there exists considerable and unwavering public concern about economic inequality in the country. South Africans are acutely aware of how unequal their society is. Over the last decade, a significant majority of the population across social groups has consistently voiced the view that the income gap in the country is too large, articulated a strong preference for a more equitable social structure, and acknowledged the class tensions and social divisions that economic inequality has produced. In a context where the labour market is the predominant source of economic inequality and set against mounting calls for a national minimum wage, it is also apparent that there is a preference for a narrowing of disparities in earnings, with a moderate rise in earnings for those on low salaries and a reduction for those in high-paying occupations. The survey findings do, however, suggest that South Africans are willing to tolerate fairly high levels of inequality in spite of their general aversion for inequality, and this is consistent with what's been found in other high inequality contexts such as Brazil. Nonetheless, from a social justice point of view, these beliefs about inequality could be regarded positively as a desire for a more equitable and fair society. Linked to this concern about income inequality, we also find majority support for the state assuming the principal responsibility for reducing inequality, even though this has shown a declining trend during the last decade. Race and class differences characterize the survey results, though it does need to be emphasized that on average, a majority of better-off South Africans are in favour of government redistribution. We find confirmatory evidence is provided for a significant principal implementation gap, with support for a number of specific redress policies lagging behind general support for social justice in the country. These disparities are more distinct for policies that are more race preferential in nature relative to those that are designed as more anti-poverty measures. They are also more prominent based on the race group of the attitude holder than his or her economic position in society. Black adults were found to be more supportive of race-based redress policy than white adults, and to a lesser degree coloured and Indian South Africans. The intergroup differences narrow considerably when referring to class-based policy measures. This lends some credence to the notion that from the academic community in South Africa for a paradigmatic change in policy, with the focus more on class-based redress agenda than one that is primarily focused on racial redress. Given the youthful nature of South Africa's demographic profile, and the fact that many of today's young adults grew up under a democratic political system, strong intergenerational differences were expected. Specifically, the so-called born-free generation were expected to exhibit different values and citizenship norms to older citizens, including a deeper commitment to transformation and redress. Somewhat surprisingly, the analysis shows that the findings on interracial differences in support for redress policies are largely reproduced when we examined intra-racial class and cohort differences. Class-based attitudinal differences within race groups tend to be nominal to modest in nature, while in many ways the new post-apartheid generation seem to reflect similar ideological positions to redress policy as older cohorts. This confirms the conclusions reached by several other South African scholars that the transition to democracy has not produced a new citizen that is more greatly predisposed towards democratic principles such as equality and redress, and that salient attitudinal fault lines have been transferred to a new generation. More positively, there does seem to exist a firmer basis for a social compact about preferences for interventions designed to produce a more just society than is commonly assumed. South Africans may not be able to fully agree about the specific elements that constitute a socially just response to the persistently high levels of economic inequality that face the country. Yet, the common identification of and concern with injustice, together with a broad-based commitment to government redistribution and class-based social policies, could serve as a solid foundation on which to forge progress towards a more equitable and caring society. This examination of South African attitudes towards inequality represents the second in three components to the work undertaken as part of the ESRC Pathfinder grant. The first being a detailed study of small area level estimates of inequality. The second one, the attitudes. The third and final phase of the analysis, which is currently underway, looks at the production of a new data set in which the inequality exposure measures are merged with the SESAS 2009 data. Currently, work is underway with the Oxford University Department of Statistics on multi-level models that examine the associations between exposure and inequality attitudes amongst the poor and the non-poor. A range of academic papers have been prepared and submitted linked to the spatial inequality and attitudinal components of the project. The project report will also be made freely available through the ESRC website, and it's important also just to emphasize that the project serves as a demonstration of the value of South African data sets and the added value of linking them together for new policy relevant purposes. This brings us to the end of the presentation. Should you have any queries regarding the content of what has been presented, please feel free to contact David McLennan or myself. All project-related outputs associated with the ESRC Pathfinder grant on inequality have been archived and are freely downloadable off the ESRC website.